Olá, boa tarde, pessoal. Estamos hoje aqui para o último seminário desta disciplina de seminários de ensino do programa de pós-graduação em Interunidades e Ensino de Ciências da USP. Espero que vocês tenham gostado do semestre. Lembro que todas as palestras, todas as conversas que tivemos com os palestrantes ao longo deste semestre estão gravadas e disponíveis no canal do YouTube do programa. Assistam, divulguem para seus colegas, é um acervo aí importante que fica para alunos de outras disciplinas, enfim, fica para o futuro aí do curso. Hoje é com muita satisfação que a gente vai ter a apresentação do professor Gabor Zempler. O professor Gabor da universidade, que eu não vou arriscar falar o nome. I'm sorry, Gabor, I'm trying to present you.
Ötvös Loránd Tudományegyetem.
Yes, I hope this was a good thing you said.
It's just like said the name of the university.
Yes.
Loránd Ötvös University.
Okay. Loránd Utva?
Ötvös.
Loránd University. Thank you, Gabor. So he's here with us. He will start pretty soon. Ele vai começar em seguida. Eu só gostaria de salientar alguns pontos do currículo dele, enfim, os temas de pesquisa a que ele se dedica. O Gabor trabalha mais especificamente com a física, com a história da física, mas também com a história da filosofia em geral, com metodologia, com teorias de argumentação. Então, as suas publicações vão um pouco por aí. Ele tem vários trabalhos relacionando estudos de física dos físicos clássicos com os trabalhos de Goethe. E o último trabalho mais recente que está apresentado aqui no site da universidade é justamente um artigo de 2020 em parceria com o nosso conhecido colaborador, o Douglas Altin. Os dois escrevem um texto sobre justamente o lugar da argumentação no ensino de ciências e naquela epistemologia da ciência integral que o Douglas Altin já apresentou aqui para a gente também em outras oportunidades. So that's it, Gabor. I just mentioned some of your works. We are very honored to have you here with us today. So I will leave you with the mic. You can start whenever you want.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria-Lise, and thank you for this invitation. I'd love to be there in person, but I'm also extremely happy that we can have a talk after this lecture. And maybe can you share the slides?
Yeah. Yes, here they are.
So I'm from Budapest, Hungary. In fact, I think both with respect to science education and partly with respect to, for example, our recent politics, we share a lot with regards to development. Originally, well, I was a high school teacher for biology and chemistry, moved on to history and philosophy of science, and I'm currently working in a business school, also affiliated with a research group. The talk I want to give today is not really just a talk, it will have some activities in it. I hope we can somehow make use of this online environment. And during the talk, I will address a number of issues while also giving a background to the motivation that I, in general, have behind various projects. So, first of all, I will talk about case studies in history and philosophy of science, that is HPS in the first abbreviation. is clearly that has had huge impact on the discipline of how historians think for now, basically, I would say 2 generations, that instead of providing just long disciplinary narratives of a science, they would focus on rich, contextually detailed case studies. So, as I grew up in Hungary, also history of methodology was quite well known. So I kind of had an early interest in history and philosophy of science, in STS, which is also called Science and Technology Studies, and as I was a high school teacher, in Nature of Science, that is NOS, as you know, these are abbreviations that you often find in Anglo-Saxon articles and literature. So basically, these case studies for the disciplines have always provided lots of resources to study what a proof is. What is a theory? How is a theory developed by a single individual or by a group? And in the last decades or 3 decades, the role of the social, the communities, has clearly increased. Another of these issues or long term interests has been my interest in controversies. That is, I've for over 20 years been teaching argumentation. I was lucky to grow up in Hungary at a department that introduced informal logic to university curricula. And this went hand in hand with an interest in methodology, with philosophical issues like how to reconstruct the position of a scientist, how to reconstruct the argument of a scientist, and also some more modern or more prevalent issues. For example, that when controversies emerge, very often there are radical black and white views. That is, polarization becomes an issue, both in societies, but also in many cases in the development of science. So basically, to summarize the issues that start with C, a third issue is, I think, a role that as a historian of science one always faces. I can enjoy my profession and be wrapped up in a library studying the archives to create better and more detailed narratives, but really, will it have any educational relevance or relevance in contemporary debates? And at the end of the talk, I will get back to some of these issues. I would just like to sort of wrap up these issues of the case studies by saying that some historians of science, for example, Naomi Orres' case, were also coming from an HPS, a history and philosophy of science background, and they basically learned the techniques to develop these case studies for Orres' case on plate tectonics, and then moved on to to use it in contemporary debates, for example, to disprove climate skeptic positions. So this is like one group of motivations that I will sort of get back to at various points in the talk. And another group of these issues, which I just simply wrote as keywords starting with D, is demarcation. That is, when we teach science, we somehow have to give an idea about what that thing is, what isn't part of science. Can we say that this is good science and that is bad science? How can we provide this view to the students? And here I will list some work that I was very happy to do with Douglas Olchin. And this is an issue of science and media literacy. So I will get back to this part near the end of my talk. As an educationalist or someone really interested in teaching and developing teaching tools, I always had didactic interests in conceptual development and change, in the development of critical judgment and reflective judgment. And currently in a business school, we are developing a course using science education to business students on expertise and transdisciplinarity. And the last major issue is really our climate of communication and our discourse, basically our view of democracy, where, as I earlier mentioned, argumentation and informal logic, I had always an interest in critical thinking, but also in the issues that rationality raises in societies, so socio-scientific issues and our changing concepts of rationality. So I don't want to make the introduction too long, but this is something that we can kind of keep thinking about as I try to touch on the much more concrete or specific aspects. Basically, I thought of first talking about case studies, which I at times deliberately developed for multiple audiences. For example, a history of vision, color, and light theories, lots of primary texts with supporting reading materials, questions, essay topics that I used in an interdisciplinary course in Switzerland. So I will basically soon invite you to a small game concerning illusions and problems. And after that, I will move on to introduce a more theoretically motivated philosophical or research issue that is concerned with Newton's new theory of light and colors. So basically, most of the historical case studies are in this domain. I can also mention Goethe and or the logical positivist Otto Neurath if you study visuals in science or in science communication. His isotype was important, or if you know of logical positivism, then he was one of the key figures of unified science. But I do have some more, well, arcane or strange issues that I'm interested in. As I worked originally in biology, I still have an interest in development of morphology, and I'm also interested in how non-traditional conceptual systems like traditional Chinese medicine or acupuncture fuse in contemporary research with large-scale infrastructures like fMRI. So this is a sample of some of the case studies that I could have picked from. I also mentioned in the abstract the third one, which I don't think I want to have time for, but we can talk about Molyneux's problem. But here is the first little challenge of the of today's talk. Basically, I think we all notice that the horizon full moon often appears huge. In fact, this is one of the earliest known sort of strange celestial phenomena. So I would be very interested if you could read the three questions. You can say I agree with it or disagree with it, either of them, and then in just one line paste the answers. For example, agree, disagree, agree, or disagree, disagree, disagree. So the first question is, uh, do you agree that this is the case, that the moon is much greater when placed in the horizon, that is after it rises, than when it is in the meridian, when it is on top of us? Agree or disagree?
Ok. Então, só para ajudá-los aí, o professor Gabor pede que vocês respondam quanto à primeira afirmação do slide, agree or disagree com essa afirmação 1. Então, aí no chat mesmo, vocês podem colocar, por favor, número 1, agree or disagree, ok? Ou como a Cibele já respondeu, apenas o D de disagree, ou o A of agree. So he is waiting you.
I think it's good if you can also wait for the 3 and then paste all 3 answers, and then there will be 2 more answers.
Okay. So it's important to put the number of it.
Yeah, so 1, agree, 2, okay. So first question is, so do you agree with what already a clay tablet has written 2,700 years ago? So that's the first. The second question is, if you can think about this phenomena, this large moon, is it further away in appearance than the moon on top of us, or the moon that's in a zenith position? And third, I'd be very interested to hear your opinion whether it's a physical phenomenon or not. Okay, so maybe we have a little time, and then I will need to move on. So if yeah, this is great if you write something like 1D, 2D, 3A, 2 disagreements and 1 agreement. Okay. Maybe I will collect a few or pause time for a second.
O professor está esperando as respostas. Podem fazer como a Cibele fez. 1, tarará, 2, tarará, 3, tarará. Ele vai aguardar as respostas para retomar a apresentação.
Okay, so it seems, Sibeli, you rule the community. You seem to have triggered the majority. Response. Good, thank you very much. I will move on, and after the next 2 questions, I will give you some more background to the to this whole illusion. Okay, the moon illusion is how this thing is called. So 4 says that this is a psychological phenomenon. The angular size of the moon is the same in both conditions. That is, maybe we think that the horizon moon appears bigger, but actually the angular size under which the object appears is the same. So this is question 4. And below you see another diagram which shows something that's called a flattened dome hypothesis. That because during the day, you know, when there are clouds above us, the clouds are much closer when they are sort of near us, above our head. So we kind of get used to the sky being this flattened dome, and maybe that's why we see the moon as much smaller when it's on the zenith. So if you have responses to questions 4 and 5, then I would much appreciate them, or some verbal comments by the moderators.
Meu único comentário é convidá-los a responder agora as questões 4 e 5. O Gabor está esperando. E não vou arriscar minhas respostas aí, até porque eu estou pouco concentrada em função aqui da manipulação do estúdio. Cibele, se você quiser entrar para...
But we'll have to ask Sibeli if no one triggers any responses to...
Cibele não quer entrar aqui no estúdio? Coloquei você.
Okay. I don't want to trigger the answers.
But simply, it would sound logical that if you said A to 3, that is, it is a physical phenomenon, then you should say D to 4, that is, it should not be. You disagree that it's a psychological phenomena. Is
Yeah,
that right?
this is the logical consequence, of course.
Yeah.
But I'm tempted to say that this is a psychological phenomenon, contradicting my first answer.
Okay. Okay. So thank you for the responses, and now we can see that there are all kinds of responses. If it's fine, you can still paste it in, but I will move on to sort of give a little more background for the history of the so-called moon illusion. Basically, I think it's a good case study to show that from very simple observations, we can really develop very complex explanations if we have more than 2000 years. So basically, this old recognition that the horizon full moon appears huge was noticed and taken up in Greece, and it became one of the standard puzzles that both the ancient but also some medieval theories were trying to solve. But of course, they had all kinds of different solutions. Some put it as a problem of physics. Very often, it was classified as an area or as belonging to meteorology, something that deals with the world between our corruptible earthly life and the celestial realm. Often it was taken to have optical importance, but for some people it was also important as a psychological or potentially physiological sort of phenomenon. I just give you one example. I think the mathematician Gauss, for example, made studies looking at the moon in all kinds of positions, sort of standing up, bending down, and looking back through his legs, for example. But Aristotle and a lot of the authors after him uh, considered that it might be something that has to do with the atmosphere, somehow the air, the medium through which we see, somehow the mist makes these objects bigger. So maybe it's the vapors that somehow cause the increase in size. And I think this is what Sibeli was also saying to some extent. And I think that a lot of the physicists generally tend to have this first impression. So the first question is that if it's really the vapors and the mist in the air, then it should be seen under a larger angle. So the angular size should really appear. At this point, when I ask physicists and they do calculations, they realize that taking the atmosphere into account would make the moon uh, more, well, less shaped than what it's really like a sphere, but it would distort its shape. So usually when physicists think about it, they give up. But I also want to give some historical background because already Alhazen or Ibn al-Haytham, an 11th century Muslim scholar, really thought of this illusion as part of a psychological phenomenon. So if you voted for the flattened dome, then you voted for Alhazen's theory, who basically thought, and I quote the part in bold, that you have to make a conjecture made by the sight regarding the greater distance. So Alhazen thought already of the visual system as something that kind of projects some theories into what is sort of objectively seen. So, for example, the size and the distance seem to have a relation to one another, and because you think you have a fair judgment for the distance, you also think you know the size of the object. Okay, so people voting or agreeing with the statement 5, they voted for Alhazen. If I go even further up, it's really the 17th century where the scientific consensus emerges that this is not a physical phenomenon. That is, statement 3 is D. The correct answer is D, and we've known it for over 300 years. So, for example, Bishop Berkeley, the well-known philosopher, wrote a really interesting treatise on optics, and he already takes it as a fact measured by astronomers lots of times that it's the same angular size, but we still see an illusion. So he develops a theory that, to a large extent, is developed to answer the moon illusion. So here we also have an example where the illusion triggered philosophical reflection and new ideas about vision and sight. In fact, this hasn't really stopped since. In modern science, I would say that the search for one true explanation has led to lots of possible explanations. But before I go to these various possible explanations, I just thought that I highlight a few aspects of the case study in general. One, today there are whole special lab apparatuses, laboratory settings to study the moon illusion. So it has become a part of experimental science. You don't have to wait for the full moon to study the moon illusion, and there are standardized tests for the illusion. As a result, there's also large agreement that it's basically not just a simple illusion, because it has a primary aspect, the size distance, the size difference that I perceive. It looks much bigger on the horizon. But there's a secondary aspect, a distance aspect, and most people actually feel that this moon is closer. So it's not just larger, but it's also closer. So people who wrote 2D, I think, were right. We can go back to that, but I think that was basically denying the secondary aspect. And so even today, the moon illusion is studied because it's a paradigm example of a quite general or strange perceptual paradox, the size-distance paradox. How can it appear larger and closer when you seem to have conflicting size and distance judgments of the object when it's in two positions? I can go further on to describe the various possible explanations, but here are just funny little facts. When astronauts travel up in space, they realize that from a certain distance, the Earth suddenly starts to shrink. And from a certain distance, also on airplanes, we have something that might be called a toy illusion at times. There's another airplane, but there are no surrounding objects, and the other airplane looks like a small toy. Okay. Also, there might be actual physiological responses that influence distance and size perception depending on how high we look up in the sky. So even Gauss, whom I mentioned, the mathematician, was working on something that might play a role in the explanation. And also with pupil changes, the depth of vision changes, and the horizon moon is usually not as bright as the zenith moon. So our whole perceptual apparatus is doing things differently in the two perceptual setups. So to cut this short story to an end, we were really looking for one good explanation. I could say there is a dominant explanation, by the way, but it seems that this simple phenomenon has really rich resources in how it tricks our senses. Okay, so this was a typical case study. Do you have any questions to this part, or should I move on? Or should we go back to the questions, or was it clear enough?
It's up to you. I don't have any question here in the chat, so we can move on.
Okay, I thank very much then the participation. Okay, so that's kind of the story cut short. Second, I wanted to go more into technical details, but I see that I'm not talking too fast, so I will only outline this part of the talk. Basically, it's concerned with Newton, Newton's discovery of the heterogeneity of white light. But I've also uploaded a document which maybe afterwards you can share or discuss if this seems interesting, but I will spend considerably less time on this case study, basically just highlighting some of the other interests that I have with case studies. Newton was still a young man when he published, well, not too long after the plague years, his first publication, which was a radical new theory of light and colors. Near the image, which is a later image, but to the left, you can see a quote: "The science of colors can become mathematical, and there's as much certainty in it as in any other part of optics." So basically, this is a crucial moment in the history of science, because something that was considered to be a directly sensible but not quantifiable aspect of nature, according to Newton, can be mathematized. So this is a radical theory. Of course, physicists learn a lot about the theory and the heterogeneity of light, what Newton called refrangibility. Here in the diagram, you can see how various light colors sort of cast an image at various points on the prism. What I'm really interested in this case study is because when Newton first wrote this paper, no one accepted him. Not his friends or colleagues or other British naturalists, not the Jesuits who spoke English and left England some years earlier, not Huygens, Christian Huygens. So basically, Newton, this genius, publishes something that really gets little credit. No one really becomes a convert. And then for about 20, 30 years, nothing happens or not much happens. But based on this controversy, Newton really repositions his argument. And when the mature, the already well-known and famous Newton publishes the Optics, then it becomes one of the most popular readings of the 18th century, really one of the catalysts for the scientific revolution. So I'm really interested in a theory that didn't change in a generation, apparently, at least that's what most analysts say. However, it didn't convince a generation of rational thinkers, but somehow in a later age, a different generation of rational thinkers suddenly say that this is one of the greatest, aspects of modern science. So this slide basically shows our approach to text reconstruction, which links the case study analysis and the historical work with argument analysis, because I'm interested in this case not just in an abstract position from all the papers, or maybe an abstract position that is somehow developing, but I'm really interested in the variations as to different criticisms. Newton defends his theory in different ways. Maybe it's good if I give you just few or some of the more surprising examples. Within 4 years, in the exchange of letters, Newton moved from a very strong position, top left corner. Colors belong to physics, but the science can be considered mathematical as they are treated by mathematical reasoning. This is before his publication of the letter. By the end, in a letter to a Jesuit, he says, if I would say that rays differently refrangible have no appropriate colors, all your objections would cease, which basically, for those who know this theory in more detail, means that he doesn't think that colors can be mathematized, because with any color, there's no specific refrangibility. So this basically means giving up the claim. The same radical shift occurs in methodology. Before the end of the controversy, when he meets some of his most arduous and fiercest opponents, some Jesuit Aristotelian thinkers, he's trying to play by the Jesuits' game. He's trying to go for demonstrative knowledge. The only way to examine a demonstrated proposition is to examine the demonstration. And he says that he has demonstrated his theory in this short letter, the 10-page letter. But after the Jesuit debate, after stopping the debate, not allowing some of the papers to be published, he basically, in the optics, in the late work, states, arguing from experiments and observations that he is doing by induction can be no demonstration of general conclusions. So one can see how in the critique or in the criticism phase, Newton is providing a very strong position, a very strong claim, a very strong argument. But then, a generation later, the same theory appears as a part of an inductive science with lots of experiments, not just 10 pages, but 300 pages. So these are just a few examples of these changes. And basically, the document that I uploaded is a poster presentation that sort of focuses on the understanding of the seriousness of this shift in Newton. But I just want to give you here a diagram, and I think I would like to congratulate anyone who can write in the comments, why is this diagram strange? What's strange about this diagram?
Certo. Professor Gabor convida vocês a escreverem aí no chat o que tem de estranho nesse diagrama. Vocês podem escrever em português, se quiserem, eu tento traduzir, ou em inglês, como queiram. Ele está aguardando uns minutinhos.
If you know how a camera makes a picture, or if you know camera obscuras, then my sort of easier question is this a proper camera obscura drawing? Is everything okay on this drawing as a camera obscura drawing?
I would say that it's not. It's strange because there are two images and they are not exactly the house, the church, and they are not in the same plan. And what more?
Okay, so this is a complex drawing from Newton's lectures. He gave lectures at the University of Cambridge before publishing this letter, but he never published these lectures. So it's lecture notes that were found in the library, but were not published until much later. And there's the eye with a little prism in the lower right part. You don't have to care about it. It's basically a side image of how you see the displacement in a prism. So if you take that part out in the right lower quarter, then you basically get something like a normal camera obscura drawing. But of course, in a camera obscura, even a child knows, and every university student already generations before Newton knew, that everything gets inverted. So the image always gets inverted, but there's something that is not inverted in this image. What? Maybe Sibeli can help, or...
Alguém quer responder o que não está invertido nessa figura?
I'm not sure, but did you refer to the sun image?
Yes.
Yeah.
If you look at the sun itself, it's not inverted. And if you think of Newton's theory as a physical theory of light particles, then you want to somehow have an image of the spectrum, something that's the colored patch on the wall that comes from this stream of particles. But this really contradicts the whole tradition of the camera obscura drawings. And after this single drawing, there are certain types of drawings that Newton never uses. And basically, if you're interested in the details, this is one of my favorite kind of research topics. How did the diagrams change? And how these diagrams change differently depending on the country, and how Newton's views were seen. So just staying with this image, in England, the corpuscular theory was really well accepted, and there are way fewer camera obscura type diagrams for Newton's theory. But in France, it was questioned for a long time. So in France, you see a different tradition and also a different interpretation of the theory. So this is a topic that kind of interests me, also a case study, and I think it also shows somehow through this picture that something, a dodgy thing, a little problem that Newton already recognizes before his first ever publication about the theory of colors can really tell a great deal about how later he communicated with regards to all kinds of optical questions or even physical questions on the nature of light. To move on and wrap up, I thought that at the end I would get back to some of the science and media literacy issues and some of the more recent things that I'm interested in. So basically, this is the same slide we have seen earlier. And one of the papers I think that was suggested is a paper where basically I think Douglas Olchin deserves much of the credit, but we worked on basically a perspective of trying to understand the richness of science, not by trying to give a simplified view, but rather by giving a mediated view of science. So, for example, some of these case studies that I highlighted can easily be put in a sequence, how scientists from empirical phenomena make all kinds of arguments, debate, even data at some times. They kind of figure out the observations, that there is a primary and secondary aspect, for example, for the Moon illusion. They make all kinds of reasoning moves, they argue, and then they write these arguments up in scientific claims. This is nature of science, or this is a 35-second summary of nature of science. But for scientific news and scientific facts, we usually don't have access directly to this portion of the world. In fact, we often hear about consensus, for example, report on climate change, or we often only hear things that are said to be scientific in a media environment, in our social news networks. So one thing that I'm very happy to discuss in more details are some of these issues on how facts for the student, consumer, and the citizen are made. And of course, this I think also has or raises questions of responsibility with regards to, you know, what will the next generation of science educators need to teach. Okay, I'll mostly skip this slide, just saying that if you're interested in argumentation, I'm sort of a national partner in a large European network for argumentation and public policy analysis. And basically, just as science education often struggles with reaching the public, reaching students, making a change when educating, the similar applies for much of the communication science theory or discipline, or the people in argument analysis, that we have tools. We think we could teach issues that are important to populations, but can we really make a change? So this is also an issue that I'm very happy to discuss. I talk about these only very shortly, because I think it's time to sort of phase out or slowly finish the talk. And I just have two more queries where I'm really interested in cultural uniformity or cultural change. The first challenge is because I think as science educators, we always face this problem of how to display and portray the relevant science for students or citizens. So if we had to draw one diagram that helped people understand the need for COVID restrictions before vaccines are available, or if there are new variants, then what would we draw as these diagrams? This is also an open question, so if you, Maria-Lise, if you can translate it, or if you have any suggestions, I'm very happy to go into that. I'll also the second challenge, so I have, yeah.
Okay, so Professor Gabor está convidando vocês a fazerem, ou enfim, a mencionarem aí, porque não dá para desenhar, se eu entendi bem, mas mencionarem o que vocês desenhariam se fosse ensinar sobre as restrições impostas pela pandemia da Covid, uma aula de ciências. O que seria mais fundamental vocês mencionarem? Uma provocação, ele vai fazer uma segunda. Sorry, Gabor, yes, you can go.
I think these are questions that I think we should be thinking of. So it's also an example of what I think as science educators, it's good to think about issues from this perspective.
Sure.
So do you think I should go on and simply say what
I've
think?
Made a small draw. It's quite simple. I just draw in 2 minutes. If you want, I don't know if I can show it with my camera. If
I
it's
think,
clear
Yeah.
enough. I
I
tried
think you
to.
can.
I don't know if you can see it.
Okay.
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 This is the first thing that came up to my mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mask.
Yeah, so
Panini.
the
One with mask, another one without mask,
mhm.
and the third
And
one.
the saliva, the saliva and virus, etc.
Okay.
Okay. I thought in Europe, I think for us, the flatten the curve was the most typical representation.
Oh
So
yes, yes.
we even have a name for the diagram. So, so I think in a lot of countries around March last year, you could really see in the media a kind of struggle to visualize and display the results somehow between a theory and the data, but drawing, to the importance or the urgency of the matter. Okay, but
Yeah,
I
this
really love
figure was also quite
Sibeli's drawing. Can I have my second challenge now?
okay.
Yes, you can go.
Okay. If I had to draw one diagram that can help people understand the severity of 2 degrees Celsius global temperature increase, I would draw. So,
Ok, a pergunta agora, o desafio agora para vocês, se você tivesse que desenhar um diagrama que ajudasse as pessoas a entender a severidade, né, a gravidade de um aumento de temperatura de 2 graus, o que você desenharia? Vocês não precisam desenhar, é claro, mas coloquem palavras aí no chat do que teria, né, das representações que vocês fariam nesses desenhos.
and I think that this is harder.
Sure.
And so basically I just want to, if we just keep thinking about it, or people who watch the YouTube channel pause it for a second and make a drawing, then I can move on and say just a last word about why I think this is harder.
Okay.
Because I think it's not hard to have various solutions or more than one solution. So here to the left, we see a diagram that easily kind of tells us what happens when the average temperature increases. But we also have an issue that the variance increases, more extreme weather events. So you see a diagram on the right representing it. But already there are, below a certain age, this will not really help because you can't put the two together. If you put the two together, it kind of becomes less convincing because there's not enough visual similarity between the two curves. So I think whenever we are facing social issues or social problems, then as science educators, these are some of the approaches or attitudes that we can be sort of vigilant about or interested in trying to trigger interaction with the students. I think that was really all. So I thank you for listening. I hope you could understand most of it. And I'm really looking forward to questions, comments.
Thank you, Gabon. We have some points here in the chat for your second challenge. Aurelio Bianco wrote, probably he would draw an ocean invading a city. Josemar wrote that she would make a drawing representing the increase in tau. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Marcia, she would draw an infographic showing animals and environment in modification. And
Great.
I can see from the answers that we were all, as Sibel make her draw, we were thinking about images, spatial images, and you were showing us diagrams, scientific diagrams. Yeah.
Because I think you took the message to the public side really seriously, which I was also interested in, but I'm also interested in science education as a way of informing people that helps them also give them more general tools for understanding science related issues. So I really liked these ideas. Maybe my use of diagrams was a bit ambiguous, uh, and but I, in a way, I can rephrase my original question. What's the best way of informing the public and educating about science at the same time? Because I think during the COVID, we actually saw two phenomena or two processes. One was information about, on the level of the virus, on the level of the pandemic, on the level of the population. What's the information flow? But also during this information flow, how much more do we know about molecular genetics? How much more we do know about exponential curves? So I think the COVID is also an enormous time for raising science education standards in societies, if the right forms of communication are selected and supported.
Sure. I could not agree more with you. I'm just going to take
Yeah,
out your presentation.
Thank you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we have lots of points, interesting points to discuss with you now. Sibel, are you going to start?
first I'd like to thank you for the talk, and also just to let you know that your English were quite clear, and I'm quite sure that everyone could follow you. I don't know if I can use my prerogative of being here and make a question. May I, Marilisa?
Yes, please. While people are putting their questions there, yes, you can start.
Gabor, I'm thinking about how my first idea of making a draw and the pictures that people suggested, which are more visual pictures instead of scientific pictures. It's not really a question, it's more a comment, and I would like to hear your comments on my comment. I wonder how I'm talking as a science teacher. As a science teacher, I understand that we should teach people to read diagrams, to understand this abstract language. But in order to be effective on the public communication, shouldn't we use a combination of both?
I think this is a really big topic. Do you want to finish it or make it more specific, or?
No, it's an idea that came up to my mind, and it's something that I'm always struggling with. When we think about science outreach and all these issues related to public communication of science, we are always struggling with this two different approaches. Because when we think about educating in science language, educating science culture, it's we have to use diagrams. We have to teach students to read diagrams, to work with them. But when we are talking about public communication to a wide public,
I really understand the depth of this, and I think Isabella also nicely summarized this in a comment, and so I just come. So I want to respond with a paradox. So I think the situation is paradoxical, okay? Because if you're making emotionally uh, uplifting messages or disturbing messages, so if there's a lot on the emotional side of communication, then the memory might be longer. You can remember things for more if you had specific emotions as opposed to having no emotions. So there has to be some emotive content. But as soon as you have the emotions, you're not really slow, systematically processing things as a scientist. So I think that there's this inherent tension in science communication and science education, that on the one hand we take the content, science content, to be a tool or a vehicle to developing talent, developing thinking skills, more abstract thinking, uh, being able to monitor, biases or things that I'm not very good with statistical reasoning, things that limit our good decision making capacities. So there's the tension in this. I try to sort of cut it shorter. So if there's this emotional side, then systematic thinking suffers. If there's the systematic thinking side, then we're developing something, but it's hard. It's not necessarily fun. It comes with fatigue, nearly like physical activity. So I always try to stress how in physical activities you develop, and you somehow have to feel that the same thing with your brain. Otherwise, you might not feel that you're developing, or there might not be more development. And to give I think one can give some examples to sort of show how this tension plays out. When you look at I don't know, the Animal Planet or these channels, Discovery Channel, you see movies about nature, and it's always the emotional adjectives are just abounding in the text. The highest canyon in West, whatever, the longest, you know, the, so to keep the attention, you're actually overusing these adjectives to keep attention alive. But really, at some point, this then becomes something that really is enjoyed by a small part of the community. It becomes, subculture specific, as opposed to reaching a wider than before audience. So, for example, that's, I think, attention. You want to make the movies about living animals interesting, but you're actually lowering the standards for communicating ideas because you're dramatizing it, and then you're showing much less of science, of how science really is. And I think the core issues are really, we need people who can make good judgments. So we need to teach lots of things as science teachers to help them make better judgments. Uh, and a lot of it is linked up with our knowledge of the natural world.
Yeah, perhaps we should consider that the goals of science education are different from the goals of science outreach.
I think the very
Because
general
in a
goals.
situation like this COVID situation, we have an emergency. We need people staying at home, and I'm, and it's much harder for people understanding diagrams or even flattening curves. I remember in this period of we have to flatten the curve, we have to flatten the curve, there were some videos illustrating with some, I don't remember very well, but there are lots of people trying to enter in a small role in the hole, and depending on how many people are using this hole, it works or it doesn't work, making some analogies with deflecting the curve. So, and it made it these kind of simple videos or analogic videos could reach more people than this idea of abstract curve. So we were in an emergency. So this is why I think that the goals are different. In the long term, it would be
Mhm.
wonderful if everyone could understand. Uh, um,
I think I think we really will only see in a year or two how the different responses will affect the population in the long run. So, in Hungary, I must say there was very poor science communication, very few diagrams. A policeman stood out and said, "You have to do this, and that's how you get registered if you don't do it, and that's the fine." And when it was said
mhm,
that you have to pay a fine, then people started to do that thing. So yes, there is this issue that I think is in many cases now worse in some countries with long traditions of critical thinking. That you can develop your critical thinking abilities, and then people team up in social media and they destroy 5G towers, mobile phone antennas. Uh, in highly developed cultures of learning. So I
Mm,
think you have this issue on the one hand that you have to have regulations if it's an emergency. It really has to be the state or some kind of not necessarily scientific forum from which you look up as important. But are you convinced that this is a good thing to do, or are you forced to do something? So I think with how populations internalize regulations, a lot depends on the science education, on the actual content, on the actual level of understanding that they are communicating black and white, but of course they mean percentages.
yeah. I, I was thinking about this cultural and educational differences. If we compare, for instance, the news on TV here, so I was watching in Brazil, but also um, regularly following the news on CNN, the American CNN, the Latin American CNN, and BBC and France, uh, France 2, France 5. I don't know how the name here. And we, I think I could perceive a difference in this point. Um, the use of infographics and schemes are much higher, much more frequent in CNN, for instance, much more than in our Brazilian news on TV. So I think this is related to what you talked about. There is the
I
cultural
think it makes a
problem.
huge difference how
Yeah,
politicians pose next to diagrams or not. So in certain cultures, also in Hungary, we hardly ever see a politician, a power figure, linked up with a scientific representation, like a flatten the curve diagram.
Mm-hmm.
While in lots of countries, it's either directly a minister, a prime minister, or Trump is there, but someone else is talking. Even in the U.S., is talking about the specific scientific representation. We basically only had the culture of a written, oral, legal state as a state response to the crisis. It was oral communication of crisis regulations and then the written regulations, just text.
Yeah.
In Brazil, we had an interesting phenomenon about that because as you know, we have a negationist president, and he refused to make severe rules like punishing who doesn't obey the isolating rules or things like that. He was always in public agglomerating with many people, and he refused to wear masks, all these things that you probably know. He's a negationist. And apart that, it's interesting that the public interest for scientific issues, I have the feeling that it rised a lot, and we had some kind of pop star science communicators. We have some people that there's a guy called como que é o nome dele, Marilice? Yamarino. There's a biologist called Yamarino. He turned into a superstar because with his YouTube videos explaining about the pandemic, about the virus, about flattening curves. So at the same time, we have official negationist positions. The scientific community and the public community we somehow felt that it's serious and we have to listen to science. This is an interesting phenomenon, and it can be easily seen that we have despite the low vaccination availability, we have a high vaccination rate. So even with all this negationist official position, all the neglectment of all the Minister of Health, all these things, we have a high vaccination rate. And it's interesting to see, to understand how, I don't have a clear explanation, probably it's due to our vaccination culture. In Brazil, we take all vaccines you can imagine since we are born. So we have this vaccination culture. But at the same time, when things got really serious, we followed the science instead of the negationist politician.
May I move forward to another question? I think that is from Lillian. It's up to you. Don't you want to make your question?
I don't know if I made it in a clear way, but I enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you for it. And I'd like to know how you would deal concerning the changes in Newton's theory of light and colors in two occasions. First, in 2 years you mentioned, and besides that, how would you deal with the reception it got as it was proposed? And how would you deal with this subject in your class? Because you said that you told us that you work with case studies, and you mentioned several ways: history, philosophy, of science, methodology, argumentation, and so I would like, how would you deal with this subject? If you could talk.
With the Newton's theory.
Yes.
And both the discovery and the reception.
Yes, the reception, more the reception,
Okay.
and how he changed the way in which he presented it, and how would you do with this? Yes, I'd like to.
Of course, traditionally, one way to start is to read texts. So for example, this book that I showed was a collection of sample texts that I assembled for master level university students, but coming both from engineering, chemistry, physics, mathematics, all the way to philosophy and classics. So it was basically it was text based. So I think an easy way to do, if you're working on a seminar or even with students, you can simply work with small chunks of texts. And I was trying to find historical periods where still everyone could kind of understand it. So it's hard to go in some areas above the 17th century because it becomes very technical. But that's an easy and kind of general answer. But for example, this textbook was used for master's students to introduce them to history of science. And this year I'm teaching business studies university students. There was a family occurrence. I had to jump in to teach a class. I had an idea, how can I sort of give some sense of the historical development, and I provided some of these case studies for students who are on a totally different level, highlighting different aspects of it. So that's one thing that I'm sort of trying to find historical episodes where I can make it simpler to high school students or even use it with PhD students. Okay. And now the answer to Newton. For example, there are several takes I did, but for general university student populations, I provided group work. Some people just got a prism. How is the image formed? Even working with the triangular prism is really not easy in an open room environment if you're not in a dark room or if they are not specialists. If they simply have to reconstruct what Newton did, reading the article, and all they have is a prism, and they have to kind of figure out how, a passage was, describes the experiment, then it's a really productive aspect. And then I give them different texts to develop or understand the theory differently. So some parts from the earlier and the later phase. You can read this new theory, the original first publication of Newton, as nearly a chemical proof. It really has a lot to do with the recent chemical developments of Robert Boyle. So if there are chemists, you can do a group that reads a little bit up on basically analysis and synthesis as a chemical process. And even you have the follow-up in the story. Lavoisier's first element is light. So you give them the table of Lavoisier's element, and you give a part of the second part of the letter, which really kind of talks as if it was a chemical thing, and they have a chemical interpretation, and then we have to figure out what this proof was, or what was the phenomenon, how is it linked to the proof, are we convinced by it, basically.
Thank you.
Is it detailed enough, or?
Yes, it's okay. Thank you very much.
No.
I would follow this. I was trying to write here, but now I can just talk about. I was really excited by the way you mentioned the work with historical episodes. This is an expression that we use a lot in our group, but I don't know why. There are many people that criticize us because the use of this expression. I really don't understand, since there is something Thomas Kuhn showed or mentioned in his book in 1762, the revolution, blah, blah, blah. So, but anyway, I like the way you think about historical episodes as a solution to go into the classroom um, without too much. Of course, I know you. I know you know a lot of history of science, and you are a scholar, etc. But you put it in a very simple way. So I was thinking about a teach that wants to work with a historical episode that can really try to do it, taking few original texts, as you were mentioning now, and trying to make these texts understandable, uh, uh, using it as a discussion start point with students. And so I think this is a very fruitful way to work with history of science, even if you are not so deeply instructed in history of science. Would you agree with that, or would you raise any concern about doing this?
I'm all in for historical episodes, and it's not just the episode as a historical sort of entity, because there maybe the boundary is hazy, but something that you have to do as a narrative must. You have to you have to put constraints on history. You have to pick something out. You have to put something in focus when you're teaching. So really, as a form of communication as well, I think it's an apt way of or something that's very close to how I like to see things. And I might give you maybe two examples. So this research on Newton is, of course, a research on an episode, and then some of the longer term impacts, because I followed up some of these trails for 200 years. You can see the differences in the diagram traditions for 100 years or even more. But I also used it to sort of highlight conceptual change and highlight, you remember that tricky diagram where the sun was not inverted? If we really read carefully Newton's first paper, there are two terms that he uses that are new. So he's discovering two terms. He's making new terminology. And one terminology is the property of light, refrangibility. So it's a physical property. But to really get away with that messy drawing and not to go into depths, he coins another term, spectrum, which is basically, in the camera obscura tradition, was imago solis, the image of the sun. But the imago solis is always inverted. And with the spectrum, we don't really know whether it's inverted. And Newton gives arguments that it doesn't really matter whether it's inverted or not in later phases. So you can really point, here's a new word in science. You have a traditional optical theory that's a geometrical optical theory. You have a new observational term, and you're basically establishing a physical theory of entities and the new property of these physical things, if you have the strong reading of the Newtonian sort of emission theory. So I think this is an example to sort of wrap it up that the episodes can show so much about conceptual development that help us understand why there are various traditions in understanding the theory. Do I want to stick with geometrical optics and still take heterogeneity as somehow, I take it into account in lens design? Or do I want to be nearly like a mechanistic philosopher and have a physical theory of what light is? It I think really gives depth to it. But this is a very complex issue, and I think, if you want to, I can give very simple examples where, you can, I think, work with just two simple diagrams to show similar deep insights in some sense.
Sure. Thank you.
So if you want a very short example, think of
Yes.
the Earth, very ancient measurements. You put a stick down and you measure the sun's position at the summer solstice. The brightest, longest day of the year. Where is the sun? You measure it in 2 points, in 2 locations, preferably on the north-south line. You have the same measurements in northern Africa, in Alexandria, Eratosthenes, and you have the same measurements in China, the Tang Dynasty. You can really easily draw the 2 measurements. It's both with the stick. Eratosthenes had a hypothesis that the sun is at an infinite distance, so he could calculate the diameter of the Earth. The Chinese had a hypothesis that the Earth is flat, so they could calculate the distance of the sun. And just these 2 diagrams, one is a flat use of the same measurement, and another is the use of the same measurement on a sphere, shows that both of these had assumptions. They had to take something for granted to give a result, and depending on what they granted as true, they gave very different, responses based on the same data. So maybe that's an easier example if you follow.
Very, very good example. I love it. And even because it is related with, well, I didn't know that was a Chinese conception about the planet, the Earth as a plan. And so this is something that it is worthy to go to the classroom today, because all these people trying to retake these ancient theories.
So it's, I think, from around the 7th century in the Tang Dynasty, and of course in the Chinese cosmology, the ruler, the emperor, is at the center. China is at the center, and the ruler has a mandate from heavens. So what you're really interested in is that the sun is quite close, to give it some cultural context.
Yes, very beautiful.
So, Gabor, unfortunately, I must leave. I have to pick up my son at school. So,
it was really great to
see you, and I hope to meet you in person soon. Take care and stay safe. Bye.
Okay, thank you, Sibel. We can stay a little more if there are any more questions. Let me see here. I don't think so. So I would invite you to talk more about what did you learn about the science communication in Hungary, in the country, in your country, during this year. I think, I'm not sure if Gabor is listening us? Yes, he went out. Maybe he thought, okay.
What's going on?
I think he went away. He understood that Sibel was closing the session.
Marilis.
Então, Lilian, eu vou então encerrar a transmissão. O pessoal que está no YouTube,
Nossa, que chato.
o nosso convidado achou que já era o fim da palestra. Na verdade, era só a Cibele dando tchau. Eu aproveito para lembrar vocês que este é o nosso último dia de curso, acho que vocês lembram bem, e que eu passei as instruções sobre o trabalho de conclusão da matéria por e-mail. Aquelas pessoas que por acaso não tenham recebido, é só escrever para o meu e-mail que eu reenvio. E a data prevista para a entrega era dia 4 de dezembro, ou seja, esta semana. Já falo era porque, como entendo que seria interessante aí manter uns dias a mais, considerando que fim de novembro é sempre a hora que todos estão bastante atarefados com as notas nas escolas. Então, eu estou prorrogando e vou avisar por e-mail que a data para a entrega dos trabalhos no meu e-mail, tal, segundo as mesmas regras, vale até o final da semana que vem, ok? E, sendo assim, deixo aqui as minhas palavras finais, dizendo que eu gostei muito desse semestre, gostei muito de procurar pessoas que falem, que estejam trabalhando com o ensino de ciências nas mais diferentes abordagens e, enfim, naquelas que nós pudemos, nós, enquanto grupo aqui, selecionamos e tivemos a oportunidade de contar com esses profissionais para conversar com vocês. Acho que é uma disciplina extremamente rica para o programa e espero que a gente seja sucedida aí no semestre que vem por um grupo de professores também motivados a trazerem dessa diversidade para os alunos matriculados, mas também para todos os alunos do curso e para os seguidores, né, do canal do YouTube que as professoras criaram há 1 ano e meio atrás e que eu acho que é uma conquista bacana também para o programa. Lilian, se quiser fazer nós encerraremos aí.
Gostei muito de participar também com todos vocês aqui, com os colegas e com os alunos dessa disciplina. E, enfim, e agradeço bastante, peço desculpas por alguns momentos que eu não estive presente, e desejo a todos, então, boas férias, né, e bons trabalhos também. Agora, Maria Alice, eu acho que era bom você fazer um e-mail, alguma coisa com o professor, para falar alguma coisa.
Porque só deixa eu encerrar aqui a transmissão, então, no YouTube. Até a próxima, gente. Não esqueçam, a gente está lá no e-mail respondendo as dúvidas de vocês, tá bom? Muito obrigada pela presença. Até mais. Bom trabalho, bom fim de ano, boas festas.